The Butterfly's Dream by Kerber's 314, Chapter 16, Cananoic. The way down the path of pins would be long and hard, almost as long as the wait had been. It would become colder too, as day bled to night and fall was smothered by winter. But the evergreens remained the same, the road remained the same, and the journey. Would the sun ever rise? Would spring ever come again? These questions she would have time to ponder as she walked the path alone. No sound but the hollow echo of the universe and the occasional howling of a lone wolf. It was a cool day, warm for the middle of fall. Then again, that's the way it usually was in Fire Country, where it was temperate most days of the year and unbearably hot and humid during the summer months. Except for those unexpected days when winter struck with a vengeance, it was the kind of day where one did not mind waking up late to the sun slowly nibbling away at the room's chill, incessant chirping of birds overriding the alarm which had never been set. Naruto would find contempt upon waking up like this, knocking the sands of time from his eyes, and relishing in that fleeting eternity. Nothing to do, nothing to want. He would have just returned from the hospital, being admitted shortly after his resigned spar with Sasuke. It felt as if he had done a good job recovering the intent, as the fight lasted long enough to need to be broken up by a good Samaritan shinobi and the Hokage herself. They would be dragged apart, one overbearing concern settled, and his wounds long since healed. Friends and comrades had come to visit them both, chide them over their foolishness, but not so secretly loud, but that purposefulness which the two conducted themselves with, like they had been sculpted from birth to be nemesis. His remaining welcome backs were all celebrated, while his bones knitted in casts, making him unable to feed himself the confection heaped upon him, though not unable to appreciate the affectionate doting so much like a real family. That was long since over, and the novelty of his return already waned. No one more would be coming to visit his humble apartment today. Not Sasuke, not Neji, not even Tenten, who all had their own lives to lead separate from him. That was okay. They had done their part and discharged their duty. He couldn't ask for any better companions, and not for the first time he marveled at this achievement he would never have thought possible. There was plenty of time to do as well. No missions and no obligations and no interruptions, just himself and that lazy sun which would never quite make it past the usual zenith overhead, but would still be enough to warm his toes as they stretched under the duvet. He could say that he wanted for nothing, but it would be a hollow statement in that lonesome apartment. Telling himself that he required nothing was the truth, yet it felt like a lie. He still worked towards something, for something or someone which was ever but a blank space on the page. He knew what name he wanted to put down there, but would it be legal? Would it then prevent him from squeezing in any more names upon that line? Why did he hesitate to count on that person? How could he be so against putting all his eggs in one basket when all he really wanted fit in the palm of his hands? In that empty space in his heart, his voice was cracked and hoarse. He swallowed wet his lips. It's okay for me to want to be alone, isn't it? He missed her terribly, missed what they shared like he missed a piece of his body, a big toe so he would never walk straight again and be reminded of it every day of his life. At the same time, being alone like this, holding a part of himself back from people, was agony worse than losing what they had. Sasuke had been right, and he needed to move on, find a new drive to push himself to achieve his goals. But he needed closure. He couldn't let it in like this, drowning in silence. You must feel the same. I should know, but I don't anymore. Sometimes I don't even feel human. When the time would come for him to forego his humanity, he could find company with the fox and watch the world burn. Maybe that was where he truly belonged regardless. Perhaps the beast too must be lonely in that solitary cell. Until that day when he could no longer look at himself in the mirror, he would cling with bloody nails to the reality which he had come to know, not let it slip through his fingers like it had before. It must hurt terribly. It does. There was no shock at the second voice in his empty apartment, almost like he had been expecting it. Well, someone probably had. I wish I could say that it gets easier as you get older, but it doesn't. Yamato stepped into the light, crossing the disorder in the single room apartment. No one wants to be alone, but sometimes we are even when there are so many people surrounding us. Naruto nodded at his reflection in the glass. You shouldn't feel that way, though, the Jonin spoke frankly, and without admonishment, setting the plastic wrapped bowl on the nightstand. You're young, and you have plenty of people who care about you. Despite the way the rest of the world treated him for what he was, it went unsaid. As we get older, it becomes more difficult because we tend to become what we fear most. What we fear most? Mm. Yamato nodded, trading one wall for another closer to the blonde and leaning on it. Our fears become the greatest focus in our lives, and that becomes what shapes us more than anything else. So that by the time we are old, it is the only thing we can think about. Both of them looked at the photo of their Yenin and their instructor sitting on the small dresser at the foot of the bed, children unburdened by fears. Grown-ups like to pretend that they have more to think about than children, and that's why they're unhappy. But it's not because they actually do, but because they realize how complicated the world they've woven around themselves is. If anything, it prompts them to shrink back into themselves, guard ever more against the dangers or perceived dangers which they alone have created. They develop quirks as defenses against the harsh reality, but that only serves to distance them even further from one another. You find yourself alone right now because, ironically, that is what you fear the most, or rather, you fear the loss of it more than anything. If I can give you any advice as a sensei, don't wall yourself off from the people who care about you. We get hurt sometimes, but that is part of life. It doesn't make the good parts not worth it. It was something he told himself time and time again, and never did it sink in until the words were spoken by someone else, like the fears inside his head. The understanding was only real in there. Thanks, Sensei. You're welcome, Naruto-kun. White chocolate eyes traced the sunbeam back up to its source, meeting the fulfilled stare of his student. Someday, perhaps I can take that same advice, the older man said with bitter aftertaste. There was more to Yamato than met the eye. Either set of eyes which had seen him through the same lens. Naruto knew that his presence on the team had been something special, deliberate by the old man in his benevolent scheming. Jiraiya had only confirmed it on the trip when he let slip that Yamato had been in Ambu en route before that. What kind of lonely existence that would have been, he could only imagine. It wasn't solely due to the Mokutan, though, which could quell the demon inside of him. Who should know better about the demon condition than a man who had seen it from inside and out? Like him, Yamato had been removed from society for a long time, part by force and part by choice. Because in the end, wouldn't they always have a choice? I believe in you, Sensei. He truly did. And now it was time to start believing in himself. Dear Ruby, I don't know if you're reading this, but I suppose in the end it doesn't matter because it's as much for you as it is for me. I can't deny that the distance has grown between us, and since I don't really know how to measure how close we were before, it's harder to know the change. It feels now like I'm reaching out through murky water at something I can't see but know is there, and my hands are numb. I should be able to know if you're just trying to shut me out or if we really are disconnected, but I don't. Can you still see me, feel me, as I do you? That question has haunted me. It's clear what caused it, and I can only apologize once again for what our bond has put you through. I know if you could, you would tell me it isn't my fault. At least that's what I hope you would say. All I can tell you is that it isn't some defect in you, no matter what crock they try to feed you. More than anything else, you should believe that. But again, it doesn't matter because it's time we both started believing in our own actions. Maybe in some ways we're unlucky because we got to know one another so closely. We could rely on each other instead of relying on ourselves. No matter how much it pains me now to see what you have been put through, perhaps like all things, it is for the best. I'm not saying it's a perfect world because we both know it's not. Just maybe this is what it's supposed to happen, or rather, what needs to happen. That doesn't mean I'm giving up, though. This isn't goodbye, and I won't stop trying to reach out to you. We should both continue to fight against what everyone else tells us is normal. If you can forgive me for all of that, you can forgive me for this. But fuck normal. What has that what has that word ever meant for us? Never give up on trying to make this world accept us. Never give up on yourself, and know that I won't either. I'm just starting to believe in myself. Yours forever, Naruto. Brunched on lukewarm ramen, which would mollify his belly until dinner. Naruto would stroll lazily through the village in its equally relaxed afternoon milieu, not without a care, but selectively so, caring only for a few smiles he could pick out amongst the crowd, and ignoring those of indifference and anonymity. Those were a dime a dozen, but the ones that weren't were a diamond in the rough. Just such a gem with its face of friendliness edged its way through the muck. Even just a small smile and wave at him, even from far away, was like a lighthouse on a foggy day. Naruto-san, the pig-tailed blonde sketched a small bow. It's good to see you again. A dark-haired male came up alongside her. So you're back, huh? Though feigning indifference, it was impossible for Naruto not to notice the subtleties which set it apart from the background noise. A twitch of a smirk on the pineapple head lips, legible as a book to one who had learned how to read through experience to expression alone. I should have guessed that the disturbance earlier had something to do with you. There's always more work to do when you're around. And hello to you too, Shikamaru, naming the lazy genius with a nod. Sasuke and I were just having a bit of fun. Bachan was mostly just overreacting. You know how nitpicky she gets, with a chuckle at his own understatement. He had to wonder at the other male who was muttering about troublesome blondes, just which one he was referring to. He turned to face his fellow culprit. Hey, Tamari, it's great to see you again too. You don't have to be so formal though. Just Naruto will do. All right then, Naruto. The polite smile became one of relief. What you doing here anyway? Are Gaara and Kankuro here as well? I'm afraid not. Tamari here is the new liaison between our villages, and I have been given the troublesome task of showing her around. Shikamaru explained with a half-hearted jerk of the thumb. I see. They gave him an odd look, most likely wondering if he was going to chide the two of them about their closeness, like everyone else that they had run into thus far had been unhesitant to do. Well, that's great. I guess it means I get to see more of you guys then, huh? Not just during the tuning exams. The thought had occurred to him, but could he really tease them for being a hand-picked couple when he didn't even know what one looked like? What was the difference between friendship and love, and was there a difference at all when it all boils down? And just how wrapped up in himself and his own neurosis had he been that he couldn't distinguish it? I can speak for myself, thank you. The woman arched an eyebrow at her escort, who was rubbing the phantom pain in his arm and averting his gaze. Especially if it's too troublesome for you. Anyway, she turned back to her fellow blonde, easily falling into her own repertoire. Yeah, you've been gone, but I've been at this gig a few months. I'm scheduled to head back tomorrow. Gara and Kankuro are still in Tsuna, though. If I had known you were going to be back, I'm sure he would have liked to see you. But being Katsukaige doesn't give him that much of a chance to get out these days, I'm afraid. It would be a lie to say he was not shocked, although he shouldn't have been. Perhaps that was why he was shocked. Had he been so out of the loop that he missed such an important event? What else had his introverted gaze overlooked? So he's become the Kazekage, huh? He spoke, directing his affectionate smile to the ground. That's great. That's really great. I'm happy for him. And that was the truth. To become Hokage and be acknowledged was still and always has been his dream, though it was only this morning that he had to revisit his motivations and find a new way to that ascent. The path he thought he'd seen through from the bottom had been washed out from before him, and it was yet a hard climb from here, but as long as he still had his legs, he would dare summit it. But that didn't mean he wouldn't stop to smell the roses along the way. Naruto, hey, since I didn't get a chance to celebrate before, how about we do it now? My treat, I mean, unless you don't think you have the time. As shocked as they were at the magnificent and unexpected proposal, both companions were preoccupied with trying to find a hint of jealous pains up beneath that sunny exterior. They wouldn't? Well, while that's a generous and tempting offer, I'm afraid that we are a little busy right now. She looked to her escort for support, though Shikamaru's sigh could have meant any number of things, from resigned agreement to relief to pure boredom. She's right, and as much as she'd insist that she can find her own way around the village, I still need to serve as escort per the rules, so I'm stuck with her. True in that case. She shot the lazy shinobi an irritated look. Why don't we all get together later? I'm sure that by, say, about 6 or 7, we should be just about. She cut her sentence short even before the Ambu alighted next to them, prematurely sensing his presence. Done! Uzumaki-san, the familiar, at least the man, addressed the blonde. The Hokage requested your presence. Then he turned as if noticing the boy's company for the first time. Sabaku-san, it might be best if you come too. The two named exchanged similar glances, which expressed their confusion and the innate feeling of trepidation which came with such a non sequitur. Naruto could not form a general option about events like these, which came seemingly out of the blue. Equally in his life, surprises had been both good and bad. It was this unbiased fortune that released him from much of the dread surrounding ignorance. Thus, he had no reason to suspect anything amiss, and yet it still felt like the cold shadow of an anvil had covered him and sucked the sun from his life. He would blink, and the blonde woman's pensive face disappeared to be replaced with her backside, her lithe form straining against its own skin as she hurtled through the wood to breakneck speeds, himself only a pace behind. They were moving so fast it would feel like only seconds since they had been addressed by the village leader. The fact that his friend, her brother, had been kidnapped still fresh in their minds. In actuality it had been hours since, and now well into the deep afternoon, a biting evening. These four frenzied bundles of straw-colored hair ahead of him were now damped in crimson paint as they leapt from tree to tree. Not that he could blame her for this celerity. He wanted to get there as fast as possible too. He had only just been reminiscing about his red-headed friend when informed of his capture by the same people that wanted to extract monstrous beings housed in him. Jinchuriki, the power of a human sacrifice. They had already been sacrificed once, and to be asked to give it all up again was the worst fate he could think of for someone like himself. He didn't even want to entertain what they would do if they found out about his other tenant. He tried to maintain hope, but the preemptive failure was already eating away at his heart. There, Ruby's loss of her mother had been sudden and cold, like being dumped into a pool of ice water. This was like drowning in the Atlantic. Tamari-san, we need to break for the night. Even Neji's measured voice sounded distraught, which was not reassuring to the rest. If we continue at this pace, we will still not be able to reach Suna until tomorrow at about 11 a.m. Besides, we still only have a vague idea of where the Akatsuki headed with your brother after escaping. We should wait to hear back from the trackers before we go too far out of our way. In another blink of an eye, night had already fallen when the woman turned with a snapping relay. The last traces of everything of evening light flashed shadows into the pale bags already forming under her eyes, making her look every bit as sleep-deprived and manic as her brother had so many years ago. She cracked her mouth to yell an acerbic remark, but that first syllable was intercepted by her fellow kunoichi, who skipped up to put herself in between the two. She and Tenten had formed a complex relationship in the years following their not so friendly match, and Naruto would not pretend to know what exactly it was. A non-verbal exchange was conducted in that flickering moonlight, shooting between their eyes. Whatever sort of detent they juggled, it did get Tamari to back down and come to a trotting halt. The rest of their squad landed next to the mutually seething woman as she stared infinitely at the ground. Once again, Naruto couldn't blame her. He also knew that while he was fit to go on, the rest weren't. He would realize it. She would realize it herself as well soon enough when she would collapse. He volunteered to go back and tell the squad trailing a few minutes behind that they were resting. No, I'll go, Yamato stated, giving Naruto an unmistakable stare. Besides, I should hash out a battle plan with Kakashi. You and the others make up camp and take care of the rest. No fire. Naruto nodded at the familiar orders. As the man disappeared, he hadn't quite understood what the rest entailed until catching a sidelong glance at the emotionally distraught sister. Then he got it, though quite how to go about the task, he'd no idea. I don't even think I'll be able to sleep. He nodded in sympathy and agreement. In the few hours since they'd made camp, she'd hardly touched her rations until threatened of force feeding by Tenten. Apart from that, she'd been staring fuzzily at whatever she'd been pointing towards, and Naruto was even less sure how to approach her now than before. But he knew she needed to talk to someone. He couldn't exactly rely on her to be a voice of reason inside her own head. Neither of them could. You should try. But what reason could he give besides the obvious rationale? To argue logic would be insulting to this professional woman. They were both shinobi, trained to catch a sleep's hummingbird wings, no matter how elusive. For him, ever since he was young, it had been a very clear-cut duty. There was always someone waiting for their turn. It's only fair to Kara if you do, despite how lame the excuse sounded even to him. She laughed, a single bark to which he craned his head around the tree trunk they shared to look at her. You're strange, Naruto. She shook her head before resting it on her crossed arms. Or maybe I am, because I somehow feel like I understand you. If Garo could talk to me right now, he'd say something silly and simple like that, not try to rationalize it, argue with me, or even order me as my Kazekage. He listened patiently as she reminisced about the mundane experiences, finding himself oddly interested in how his fellow Jinchuriki lived day to day. I don't know how you seem to know what's going on inside his head, but it's been like this ever since that day we met, hasn't it? She asked him, but more likely just herself. He was glad to see that he wasn't the only one who did so. I mean, you're both so different, and yet you're the same, right? Almost like you share a connection. I mean, one beyond, you know? A thought came to her, and before she could scrutinize it with her normal prejudice, which had gone AWOL, she had already voiced it to him. Nah, Naruto, this might be weird to ask, but her words stumbled, but they already had momentum. Do do you think you can, like sense him or something? Is there some sort of bond that you jerky share that to tell you if he's alive? No. He hated to hear the desperation in her voice, but false hope and lies were the only sure dangers in his experience. If only he could form a bond with everyone like he did Ruby. It did beg an interesting question. If Garo could sleep, would he also have someone on the other side? Oh, I see. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. But we will rescue him, that I know. He looked at the back of her ragged hair, and the corner of her chapped lips dyed blue in the twilight. I will not allow someone precious to me be taken away without giving it my all first. I promise we will bring him back, he said in that stereotypical intensity which never ceased to endure and reassure. Yes, she agreed faintly before refreshing. Yes, of course. Though even when he thought she was done talking and expected her to worry on him, she called out in a shy voice he'd never expected from the resilient woman. Hey, Naruto, do you mind if I talk about him just for a little bit? No, please. She talked for a while longer until she realized that she had been rambling due to fatigue, and then allowed the last remnants of words to leave her. She settled on listening to the night noise, trying to meditate on that to drown out her other more troublesome thoughts. She heard the light, syncopated breathing coming from next to her. Are you asleep? No, he answered softly, just closing my eyes so I can hear you better. That got another small chuckle out of her. I think I'd get annoyed with anyone else ignoring me, especially in this situation, she admitted, but I just can't help but marvel how you can go from 0 to 60 and then back again in a heartbeat. I swear, you can sleep anywhere. He could feel her leaning over to stare at him as he sat up against the rough tree trunk. It's only fair to Garo. I want to sleep now so that I can stay up with him when we get back. We have a lot to catch up on. You know what? I believe you. Mm-hmm. There was something light and soft which graced his forehead, familiar, deja vu, but not, almost like it had happened to someone else. Thanks, Naruto. Ruby was almost used to waking up early by now. Schedule in the institution had been rigorous, and under her uncle's tutelage she had never been allowed to sleep in anyway. She almost missed that. The thought of her uncle and where he had been the past 2 years was so stressful it almost made her want to go back to bed. But again, she knew there was not much point. She'd never been able to go back to sleep after waking up, no matter how early or late. Never. So it was early, some might say obscenely so, but there were a million and one things that she would have to do if she was going to trust herself with being a leader to other girls her senior by almost 3 years. The sun was just peeking over the horizon. Best get started. The sound was as piercing as an arrow. It had a similar effect as the three young women shot out of their beds in an automatic action, though that was as far as their unconscious response went, and all were left hanging in various states of despair when their bodies let them go. What the heck was that? Weiss rubbed her rear end as she picked herself gingerly up off the ground. I don't know, but I'm going to tell you right now that I'm not going to put up with that again. Let let anyone every weekday for the rest of my time here. The dark-haired beauty rubbed the top of her head where her perpetual bow still perched. What the hell, Ruby? Yang simply buried her head back underneath the pillow, somewhat used to the ignominious wake-up back when Crow was training her sister. Can't you let us sleep a little? It was a rough day yesterday, she muttered to her mattress, forgetting that it was Ruby herself that had done most of the heavy lifting. Said girl blinked in honest dumbfound. No, we kinda have to get up for classes. If she'd known that was all she needed to say to get the three lazy birds to shoot from their beds like there were spiders in them, that had been the next try, then she wouldn't have resorted to the whistle after poking them with the handle of Crescent Rose had failed. What time is it? Her sister demanded of the alarm clock, the only thing she'd bothered unpacking the previous night. 8:35. Wait! Weiss exclaimed, dropping her toothbrush and makeup on her way to the bathroom. Don't we have class at 9? Yes. Why didn't you wake us up sooner? The frown which had been present ever since Ruby had decided to wake her roommates deepened. She had long since resolved not to get discouraged easily, especially when it came to those social mazes she not yet solved. But in this seemingly unwinnable situation, she was debating what she had gotten herself into. You still have 25 minutes. Ah! Her partner threw her arms into the air in dramatized exasperation. We still have to get dressed and cleaned, and we haven't even unpacked where is all of our stuff. I put it away for you to save time, Ruby said with an adverted grin. You guys are really deep sleepers. Blake would beg to differ if that were she were not looking down at them from her second-story bed, which had definitely not been there last night. You made bunk beds? Really deep sleepers. Yep, Yang laughed uncomfortably, sidling up to her sister and putting her arm around her. My sister's practically a little ninja. She turned from the incredulous look she was receiving to her sister, who had been completely aloof until then and now looked like she'd seen a ghost. Hey, listen, Rubes, since you're already good to go, why don't you just wait outside while us girls get ready at our own pace? She placed the stained finger on the younger woman's lips as she opened them to say anything contrary. I promise we'll be ready in time to go to classes, and she shooed her out before the younger girl had a chance to decline. She watched her sister wordlessly comply, slumped shoulders shuffling out the entrance, and shutting the door with the barest of clicks, and only then did she realize her actions. Your sister is weird. She turned that guilt to vindictiveness and unleashed it on her sister's partner with the same finger which previously had tenderly silenced, now prepared to do so through force. Don't talk about my sister like that, she threatened. She did all of us a huge favor, and I won't have some upstart princess bad-mouthing her for doing something right. Her fiery eyes soldered their mouth shut, and she turned away from them before she could feel hypocritical. Now I'm going to use the bathroom, so you best do what you need to before the morning out here if you can. You have 15 minutes. The door to the private bathroom slammed shut, and only after the window frames settled did the remaining two dare speak. I still say she's weird. The morning had been a rocky start, and one which would set the tone for the rest of the day. This was Yang's summation at least. She would admit to a slight negative bias in the form of a personal cloud of remorse following her around from then on, guilt for the way she so childishly dismissed her sister from the dorm like she was still a child in need of guidance. The distraction it provided made it so she wouldn't be able to concentrate on anything, much less the lessons they were supposed to trudge through. She could only hope that it wouldn't be indicative of the way the rest of the year would play out, but only experience would reveal that. When time came for them to leave for classes, Ruby would still be waiting for them outside like a stray, muddling about and not knowing what else to do, having already knocked on Juniper's door and let them know that they too had 10 minutes to spare. Yang would remark at how it was nice of her to wait for them, and Ruby would offhandedly remind her older sibling that it was the leader's duty to be accountable of her teammates. It wouldn't be said in a bitter or somber way, but that solid fact as far more jarring and harsh on her ears than any childish pouting could be, more painful than an ear-splitting scream, and she had no one to blame but herself. She had slipped too easily into that older sister role, insensible of the time which had escaped them. Worse, she'd unwittingly undermined her sister's authority with that casual dismissal, and Ruby would let her put on that mask of normalcy and indulge her fantasies. They could not afford that. By acting so ignorantly, she had already set a precedence which would be hard to shrug. Whatever support she lent Ruby's command now might already be sabotaged by her own foolishness. It was only too obvious that her sister's partner had already formed an opinion on the girl. Weiss had probably taken Yang's belittling attitude as permission for outright insubordination. There was nothing she could do to fix this. She wanted to, but also knew that fighting all of Ruby's battles for her would be as demanding to her command as her previous slip-up, and so the entire first day would seem to be a wash, Weiss visibly rebelling against her juvenile command, and Ruby herself feebly trying to support them all, splitting herself thin and hesitating to assert her authority. She'd never been demurring before, and the clinic had only made her more adverse to authoritarism. The calluses she had developed against the micromanaging of her life prevented her from doing the same to anyone else, though it would be worse than even Yang could know. Ruby, too, did not possess high hopes for their team. She would tell Weiss, as the girl went to object her leadership to one of their teachers. She would snoop around just long enough for Osmond to try and sneak up on her. The man would bequeath unto her words of confidence, which in the end would tell her nothing of how to manage her problems, or why he had chosen her in the first place. She was left to wonder, as before, how the man could be so unwavering in his confidence in her when she could only see her uniqueness as a hindrance. His words only left her more in doubt. She wanted to find her own confidence, but as long as these questions remained, it felt impossible to pave the way over her pasts. After dinner she would lay on her mattress in the empty room, her teammates all off scattered or doing their own evening activities. She should have cared about their location, but was honestly too tired. She would lay there and not sleep, but rather relieve the entirety of her incarceration, whose straitjacket she couldn't escape even now. It was always tying her down, cutting her off from her will. Maybe she even agreed with Weiss, but that didn't mean that she could rewind time and tell Osmond to let her grow in ignorance. Nothing would allow her to hide that foolish diary before anyone found it, lock it up, burn it, do something and anything to hide her fatal defect. Nothing would ever make her regret writing it, never repent of who she was. Now that was a far harder task than being a team leader, but a part of it all the same. She already knew what she had decided to do, already made up her mind after all. There had been that letter in her dreams, which told her to believe in herself, and her dreams never lied. Today had failed, but that wouldn't mean that tomorrow would as well, did it? Sometimes it felt like fate had fixed her with chains back to that horrid place, never allowing her to leave and tainting her mind along with her record. Was it just the feeling, or was that the way things really were, like the curse which bound her to live half her life in her dreams? Why was she even asking this? These were not the questions she needed answers to. Her resolve was real, and sleep would only offer more proof. It's a seal barrier, Naruto informed them absently, though he felt rather useless being only able to deduct that much, staring at the paper-wrapped stone which barriered them from the Akatsuki's hideout with controlled fury. He'd only managed a few weeks of Hunjutsu study under Jiraiya's tutelage, which was enough to unveil their limitless bounds, but not enough to learn anything practical. The avenue had occurred to him after after learning how the fourth Hokage's technique could divert space and time. It revealed the possibility that he might somehow use them as a bridge between him and Ruby. Seals could be the key to figuring out how to reestablish the link if it really was broken, or, in the very worst case, close it forever in case she thought of him now as a burden. Is there any way around it? Temari asked impatiently. He shook his head pensively to the Kunoichi's question. Nothing that I'd be able to devise in the time we probably have. He glared at the forbidding kanji, wishing he could deconstruct it with his eyes. That, or set it on fire. We'll just have to abide by the normal rules and possibly suffer the consequences of whatever trap they've set up, which are there are another four around here somewhere, and they have to be peeled at the exact same time. Ignoring the other part to the question, he looked at his teammate. Neji, right? The Jonin deferred to him, already activating his all-seeing eyes to locate the others. Found them. Luckily, I brought these along. Yamato held out a palm full of earbuds, but before anyone else could grab any, Naruto placed his hand over the whole lot. Let me. Yamato nodded as he watched Naruto put one into his ears and back away before four copies of the team joined them in the small glen. The center one snapped his eyes open, and everyone held their breath as crimson eyes froze them all with an ethereal laugh echoing in their heads. Though it only lasted for a second, and then the four Naruto were gone in a howling gust of wind and a swirl of leaves that felt like fall had come early. Before anyone could even acknowledge their readiness, Naruto had already walked up to the primary tag and ripped it off with nary a word through the radio. All right, let's. His resolute blue eyes blurred in distracted shock. What is it, Naruto? What's wrong? The onlookers didn't have long to wait to find out, as before their very eyes emerged something that was almost as unpredictable as the original blonde shinobi. A replica in mutilated tones, with a blank expression, sprouted from the paper tag, not unlike Yamato's wooden replicas. The original frowned as some of the other memories from his clones flowed back into him after they were dispelled. What he had seen so far was not good, but there was still confidence enough that he could beast himself. The facsimile didn't have nearly the motivation he did to win. There was always a singular memory from one of his clones, something which gave him more reason than ever to surmount his obstacle. Without further ado, his hand slipped to the holster on his side, almost faster than his mirror image, and then there was a sound like a cat howling, a sizzling, hissing noise with tiny pops as newly constructed blood vessels burst and boiled anew. The tip of a katana was staring at him through the chest of his very likeness, mirroring the same incredulity he was sure was on his own face. We don't have time for this, Sasuke declared with a callous twist of his wrist, which bisected the barrier clone, who then dissolved into ink, sublimating into the surrounding air, not even leaving a stain on the teen's katana. Thanks for that. Naruto spoke the words while a weary frown tugged at his lips. It's not over, though. Before anyone could ask, he turned away from the mountainous boulder, blocking the cave entrance to a seemingly blank patch of forestry, staring far past the tall grass and dense corpse in the way. What now? His fellow blonde asked with impatience, her suspicion as she recognized the heavy-set recognition etched on his face. You guys go on ahead. There were a number of people who would want immediately to object, but Yamato too had observed the look on his normally reckless student's face and silenced them with but a wave of his hand. Naruto himself turned partially back to Tamari, who was the only one his sensei had absolutely no sway over. I'll finish this up quickly, I promise. Your sister looked ready to be the second person to lay into the image of Naruto that minute, but managed to restrain herself with the same kind of fortitude he demonstrated. You better. He nodded his thanks and understanding. Right, Sasuke, Tamari, you're with me. Kakashi, Neji, and Tenten, you stay out here in case one of them tries to slip away, Yamato commanded in an even tone, begrudgingly letting the Suna Kunoichi come with them because he knew there was nothing he could say or do otherwise. I'll also take the medic, just in case. So Sakura-san, you're with me. The pink-haired medical attendant had been thrust upon Sasuke when he refused to back down from the mission despite his prior injuries. Thankfully, the Gaindame Hokage's apprentice showed next to none of her master's obstinance as she nodded duly to the command. If Naruto isn't back within 30 minutes, I want you to go support him and leave the Katsuki to us. It wasn't the most ideal compromise, but Naruto knew that he could afford to take that long anyway. But he also had no other choice to go, and so the decision was clear. They sped off in different directions, with only fleeting looks back. The remaining Team Yamato and the late addition dubbed Team Kakashi headed forward to remove the obstruction from the entrance to the forbidden cavern, and Naruto threw himself far afield to where one of the ceiling tags had been placed innocuously by a waterfall. He possessed some heavy feeling for not divulging the whole truth to them. For one, he knew he couldn't, and secondly, even though he knew this was likely to be a more difficult challenge for him alone, he could honestly say he was looking forward to it. Soon he would see the waterfall in his own eyes, peeking through the thin copse of river country foliage. His other clones hadn't had much of a problem with the seals. It was as obvious a trap as it was devious. As soon as one removed the tags, the chakra imbued to break the seal would be forcibly siphoned off and copied into a doppelganger, which had the exact same capabilities and looks as its donor. For the clones, which already had a minimal amount of his chakra, it meant that they would almost all lose what little they had and dispel instantly upon removal. That, or dispel themselves and the copy's copy with a single light tap. And even if one had managed to survive, it would not last long before its meager energy ran dry. The Shadow Clone was unwittingly the best counter to this barrier, and it would make a quick worth of most of the traps, almost all of them, 1/5. It should have been a 20% chance, but somehow Naruto knew that it was far more random than that, and yet predestined by some ironic hand of fate, as much as he'd like to dally and figure out what caused this happenstance, he knew that he had a duty to fulfill. Plus, he doubted even Jiraiya himself could figure out what caused this absurd coincidence, especially if it was true and a divine intervention was at play. Despite the urgent matter, he knew he had waited for him. He approached the clearing unhurriedly, not wanting to spook the guardian construct his clone had witnessed before it dispelled. It stood there atop its discarded tag, waiting for him unwaveringly, making it obvious his caution was for naught. He still did not move with alacrity, taking the time to observe the copy, which, while it had all his weapons and clothes, was not him per se, it was her. Hello, Ruby. End of chapter 16.